Did the Treasury Minister deliver a giveaway pre-election budget through prudent use of reserves to kickstart the economy? Or was it a reckless raid on government's hard-earned savings? I suspect the answer lies somewhere between the two, but what did Tynwald members make of it? I caught up with several members after the debate. First, Arbury, Castletown and Mallow MHK, Tim Glover. You famously, along with your colleagues in the south, have said that if Castle Rushen High School isn't clearly in the budget, then your support is far from guaranteed. You would be disappointed then not to see Castle Rushen High School in that budget?
There's an awful lot of work gone on, and all the four southern MHKs have been very much kept in the brief and informed, and we just want to see clarity. We want to see this project come home now, because we're nearer to it now than we've ever been at any point during when it first came up in probably about 2006. We're talking that long ago now, nearly 20 years. I asked in my speech for real clarity from the Minister. We got an awful lot of words, but I didn't get the clarity that I was seeking. And it's noticeable as well that all four southern MHKs were amongst the 8 MHKs that voted against the budget.
Obviously, the Treasury Minister has a difficult task, not least by being parachuted into the Treasury Department at a time that when the budget had pretty much been signed and sealed. Did you see any merit in the budget?
There are good things, but as I say, it was a bit of a crash bang wallop what a picture at the moment, and clearly a pre-election budget, which is going to take an awful lot out of the reserves. But just going back to Castle Rushen High School, there is a project board there that have done an immense amount of work and have put in serious detail into the whole project. He may not have wanted to speak in too much detail, because obviously that is now in a tender type process. So I think he could have given us a little bit more, an assurance that he was really on the case, and the tremendous amount of work was there. He was determined to follow up on that work, but I didn't really hear that today, which is disappointing.
It sounds from what you're saying that you're not getting any greater reassurance behind the scenes. So are you reasonably confident or lacking confidence that the work will be commencing within the next 12 months?
Well, the last project meeting that we were at, we've got one coming up in the next month or so. The plan was to bring the capital bid to Tynwald, which it has to do, of course, at the June sitting, which then would have allowed, hopefully, spades at last in the ground during the summer. Now, that project assurance could have been given. It was very much tight timetable, but a determination from the previous Treasury and Infrastructure Ministers that this was where we were heading. I haven't had that reassurance from Mr. Thomas. And in the past, he has spoken about the need for Douglas schools, which I get, that's his patch, in preference to Castle Rushen. So that's why I'm concerned. We've now got a Treasury Minister there who I don't think gets just how urgent and how needed a new Castle Rushen High School is. So let's see what he comes back with.
Tim Glover there. Next, Onchan MHK Rob Collister. This is basically vote for me. I've just given you a load of tax back, and we're spending lots and lots of money.
As I mentioned during the members' presentation and again during my budget speech, this definitely is outlined as a budget for votes. And it's clear from the outset of what the new Treasury Minister has said in respect of that increase in personal tax allowance from £750 all the way up to £2,250. So you clearly see there's been a shift in the past few weeks from what the previous Treasury Minister was proposing to what the new Treasury Minister is proposing. But as elected members, we have to take the budget in the whole. We know there's a lot of people outside really still struggling with the cost of living crisis. So for me, it's absolutely right that I do support pensioners and I do support hard-working families. So this is why it's quite difficult to explain to the general public about why you support a budget when there's elements of it that are clearly showing warning signs.
We can't keep relying on reserves, can we? I mean, we're lucky at the moment in that stock market is booming and inflation has been high, so the reserves have kept up with the amount that we've been taking out of them. So on the face of it, they've retained their overall financial value, but they would have been much higher if we hadn't have taken 400 million out over the last few years, and another 120 million due to come out this year.
Yeah, so in this budget they're proposing another 126 million drawdown from reserves. That should be a concern for us all. We're living beyond our means in many ways. So if this was a household budget, you'd be looking at what you can pull back on to actually balance the books. And I think government has to do the same. This really, as I said in my budget speech, this is a budget that has a lot of giveaways in it, which is absolutely right given the cost of living crisis we're facing at the moment. You clearly see the pressures, everyone's suffering. Absolutely right to give something back, but it's very clear that whoever is the next Treasury Minister after the September's general election, they're going to have some real difficulties balancing this book. But also, it's also about putting that pressure on each individual department, and that includes Manx Care as well, about coming in on budget. The government can no longer afford these extra votes for extra cash. They have to come in on budget, and they have to be more disciplined in respect of making sure the departments do come back in on absolutely budget.
You're still involved in the Public Service Commission?
Yeah, so I'm obviously the chair of the Public Service Commission, so we're heavily in those negotiations with unions over pay, and obviously we keep one eye on inflation, so everybody who works within government deserves a pay rise, same as they do in the private sector, but obviously we've got to balance with what we can afford. In this budget, again, those pay increases are set around 2%, and we've got to hope that the unions can come with us on this journey and make sure that we're giving people the pay reward that they're entitled to, but also that we're not going beyond that, because from an outside point of view, they feel that the public sector is higher in pay compared to the private sector. So we've got to be mindful of that. I'm also in the Cabinet Office, and, I'm very much of the firm that the department comes in on budget. And if it isn't, then we have to ask questions. And this goes right across government. As I've said, this budget is very good in a lot of ways. I'm not sure it does actually deliver on its tagline of being one of stability, security and confidence. Clearly, that is not achieved in this budget. But obviously, they've been very honest to say, here are the whole of the problems the government is facing. We have to really push down on that discipline, the financial discipline, but also making sure that we're investing in the island for future generations.
But we've been talking about, financial discipline, first of all, even in the good times, should be at the forefront of everybody's mind. I mean, we've been in a significant financial difficulty with Isle of Man government for the best part of 2 decades now. Surely to goodness this should be ingrained in every officer's mind, and indeed every politician's mind.
Well, absolutely agreed. But when you've got such an increase in demand in services, so we'll take healthcare, for example, there's been an increase in demand in those services. You've then got to be able to put resources into that. So the question is, as I've said again in my budget speech, we have to have an honest conversation with the people of the Isle of Man about how, for example, we fund healthcare in the services, in the healthcare services in the future. Now, some of that may have to apply some additional cost. I don't know. These are the honest conversations that we have to have. Do we expect the public to maybe pay a little bit more in prescription charges? Do we expect the public to pay, to see a doctor or to see a dentist? I hope not. But they are conversations which the public and the politicians and the Manx government are going to have in the years to come. But before we have that conversation, we've got to be absolutely sure that every single department is running efficiently. Every bit of wasted cash is being dealt with, and making sure it's not a repeated occurrence. And that goes right across government. I sit on the Operation and Efficiency Board, along with the Chief Minister and along with the Minister from the Cabinet Office, and I'm seeing the works going on behind it to make sure that we're not over-employing staff and making sure every position is being double-checked to make sure they are absolutely needed for that department. And the same applies for financial discipline as well, that every department is having conversations with Treasury when they know they're not going to meet their budget.
And how much has that efficiency board actually done by way of squeezing out efficiency, squeezing savings?
Well, I know the Chief Minister's gone on the record and say we're making 10 million plus in efficiencies, and that's what's been identified. But for me, and I've said this in conversation with the Chief Minister, I would actually prefer to go out to the public with actual tangible, something I can physically touch. If the departments are telling me they've made £1 million in tangible savings, show me that, give me the evidence. I will go out to the public and explain it to the public that here is £1 million that we've efficiently saved in the last financial year. Because I've heard it again today about the Health Minister talking about how much savings and efficiency Manx Care has made since it was incorporated in 2021, but I haven't physically seen that in my palm of my hand to say this is a tangible change, something I can physically touch, something I can go out and explain to the public, because that's what the public want to see. They want to see that the changes, they want to see the efficiencies, but they also want to be able to feel it and be able to say, okay, I agree that that department has saved all of the money they can save. They now need additional resources to deliver the services we expect.
That was Rob Collister. Next up, Russian MHK Michelle Haywood.
I think it's largely a budget that I'd seen quite a lot of when I was in my ministerial role. It's a budget that's been worked up over time. I've done substantive work with Treasury when I was in the DOI in order to land a really good position for the department. Bearing in mind that there are efficiency pressures imposed by Treasury, so 2% pay uplift for departments and a 1% non-pay uplift. It's clearly below the cost of the pay settlement and clearly below the cost of inflation. So that forces departments into efficiencies there. And I think that's my take on how government efficiency arrives. It arrives by stealth and by those little decisions rather than big sweeping changes and announcements. But my real problem with the budget overall is handing out what we found today is £24 million of tax cuts with no real idea about where that's coming from, because it's not accompanied by £24 million of cut in spending. It's just going to be taken from reserves. And we are setting not only a budget that kind of sets a deficit this time, but actually it bakes in that deficit for future generations. 9 million of that 24 million was in the budget that you were working on when you were in Council of Ministers. So it's 15 million that's unfunded. Don't try and fall into Mr Thomas's trap about that. It's Mr Thomas's budget. He's taken the tax thresholds by £2,250, so he takes all responsibility for that. When Dr Allinson was in charge of it, the £750 that he'd proposed, there was actually a reduction in what was going into capital spend, but mainly recognising that the capital fund was underspent every year. And so there was some wriggle room around not allocating money into the capital fund that we knew wasn't going to be needed anyway. So that was covered, but this is not. The Southern members have all been very clear that their support for the budget relied on a new Castle Rushen High School being funded. Doesn't seem to be much sign of that in the budget. No, and the Castle Rushen High School project is currently out to procurement anyway for a price to be set for it. So it was always destined to come through the quarterly capital funding that sits outside of the budget that we have in February. There were other opportunities during the year, and this was something introduced in this administration. So that sits there. So does Portsmouth High Street. There are a number of... So do the horse trams if that business case comes forward. So does Tramway Terrace. Those things sit in the quarterly capital applications. I don't know what the current mood for this Treasury Minister is about whether he is going to carry that on or not. To my mind, it's a really sensible way of doing things because it allows you to get an up-to-date price for a project to come back to Tynwald for approval and to get that project moved through, rather than trying to store everything up and land it into a budget in February, when I don't think those things get enough scrutiny. And also you'll be trying to land so many up-to-date prices to come in on February that's almost a nightmare for the project teams. So I think this is the quarterly capital approvals was one of those moves in response to, and I hate the term lessons learned, but learning from other large capital projects about when and how you manage to work out what the cost is of those projects, and when you get Tynwald approval and how close that Tynwald approval is, and how locked in you are to that price at the start. So I think that's the right way of managing it. The PDF funding, so the project development funding that underpins those bigger capital applications, is shown in the budget, and so that indicates that those projects are still alive, but it's just a bit of a shift to not landing all the capital spend at the same time.
You're confident then that Castle Rushen High School will get supported and will go ahead?
I'm perhaps less confident than I was at the start of the year. I know that, in my time down at the DOI, I'd worked with the project management unit and working with Desk to bring that project forward and to get it to the point where, as I say, it's out for procurement now. That should give us a final cost on it, and then that should come back through Treasury, through COMIN, and into the quarterly approvals in Tynwald. My approach as Minister was obviously working at pace on that, and I'd anticipated that we should have been able to work through that and have spades in the ground by the summer. I will be thoroughly disappointed in both the new DOI Minister and the Treasury Minister if they now renege on that process.
We've been told by various members that this is an election giveaway budget. Is that fair?
I think I described the Chief Minister as being like the ringmaster with a flourish of his top hat as he played to the crowd and told everyone to look at the bright lights and the headlines. The headline on this will be huge increase in personal tax allowances. It's one of those members' comment about the concept of fiscal drag, and actually one of the ways of reducing the structural deficit in government, apart from setting budgets for departments that in effect cut their budget every year and force them into efficiencies, the other way of doing it was to allow those tax thresholds to stay where they were and create that fiscal drag that meant people were just paying a little bit more tax over time. Taking that away and putting the allowances up by the amount that the Treasury Minister has announced today effectively index links all of those. We could have changed tax thresholds every year by CPI and we'd have ended up in about the same place now over the 4 years. So we've kind of, we've benefited a little bit from the fiscal drag during that time, but suddenly we've thrown them back up. But what that does now is bake in a huge hole into the budgets, and I think that is the problem I have, is that it's fine looking at the blaring headlines, but I think, as we've heard from other members today, the problem that you've now created is £24 million hole in the budget this year and the year after and the year after. And I think what I'm really disappointed about is that in the debate in January, when we were talking about minimum wage, the Chief Minister assured us that changes in thresholds would cost £5 to £10 million, and that people who were on minimum wage would be as well off under changes in thresholds and with the reduced amount of minimum wage. And that's just not true in either case. The changes are going to cost us way more than the £5 to £10 million that he kind of picked as a ballpark figure. And those minimum wage workers, had we just put minimum wage up and left thresholds where they were, would have been substantively better off. And when you're on a minimum wage, an extra £5 a week really does make a difference to your household budgeting. So I'm utterly disappointed. I don't think there was scope for the Treasury Minister to have moved far enough to make up the difference. And I think they've realised that. But I think what we've heard today as well, which is also true, is that this doesn't particularly benefit low wage earners. There are 4,000 and a bit people who are below the tax threshold anyway before this. There's another 3,000 now that are below the tax threshold, and you don't benefit by the entire £225 of tax that you might have saved, depending on where your salary comes into that and where your earnings come into that. So those people really aren't getting £500 worth of benefit. You have to be on full-time minimum wage hours to get the £500. But we know that people at the top end of the scale will now be getting substantively more, even those that are on the taper. And genuinely, people earning £100,000 a year more than £100,000 a year don't necessarily need that extra tax money. In fact, I'm pretty sure they don't, as much as those on the lower wages did. And so we're just kind of baking in poverty by creating a tax system that is much less progressive than the one we had.
Michelle Haywood there next. Ramsey MHK, Laurie Hooper.
You reckoned that the budget was unaffordable, and yet as Health Minister you presided over at least part of the 43% increase, huge increase in health spending. Isn't this a bit like the pot calling the kettle black?
If you look back at the budget years where that happened, you can actually see that the growth in deficit spending was negligible by comparison to what we're talking about here. And like I said in my remarks, this budget doubles your deficit overnight. We never did that when I was in health. That's just unsustainable. And when we were proposing increases in funding for services, I've always stood by the fact that you need to pay for it somehow, which is why the income tax levels went up. This isn't rocket science, right? If you're going to promise people you're going to spend money on things, you have to find the money from somewhere, and you can't just empty the piggy bank to do so. Mr. Mercer was spot on. He said we've had a number of black swan events. You've had COVID, you've had Ukraine, you've had Brexit. And actually, when these things happen, you need some money in the reserves to cushion some of the impacts. Imagine what it would be like if we didn't have those reserves and COVID hits or Brexit hits or whatever it may be, because that's where this budget takes us, to a place where the only money we have left in the reserves is the money we've borrowed. Now, that is a fundamental shift for the island. The island has always prided itself on running a balanced budget. But this budget, probably for the first time, actually says, no, we're now going to be starting to rely on borrowed money to pay the bills. That is how the UK operates, how every other jurisdiction operates, and they're all in a mess because of it. We cannot allow ourselves to get in that position. We heard it from the Treasury today. We've moved away from the idea that we're an island without debt, and the argument the Treasury are now using is we have a good debt to GDP ratio. They're already shifting their approach, and that is really worrying and should be really worrying for anybody out there about worrying about the way we're going to pay for things next week and next year and the year after. It looks like we're entering into a new world of borrowing.
Hang on, though. Reserves are running at, is it 1.9 billion, something in that region? And in terms of those reserves, we only borrowed 400 million.
No, so the reserves, the National Insurance Fund, which is ring-fenced for very good reason, runs at about 1.6, 1.7 billion. The rest of the reserve, what's called the General Reserve, has about 500 million in it. 400 million of that is what we borrowed. That's the reality here. And this is what the government isn't going to be honest with people about and say, yes, we've moved into the phase now where we are spending borrowed money. We're not spending money that we've saved up over the years. We've spent that. All the money we've saved up, that's gone. Now we are spending the money we've borrowed, and they will fall back on. But the total reserves are really healthy because they want to confuse people and pretend that the National Insurance Fund is there to fund day-to-day budgets and day-to-day spending when we all know it isn't. And the risk that I think we run is if they convince people that it is, that they're allowed to dip into that, the next step is to start taking money from the national insurance pot to pay for things. And it's the slippery slope. And this is where they're starting. This budget is the one that says, no, we're going over the precipice and we're taking the rest of you with us.
The economy for the past 4 years or so has been sluggish, it's fair to say. What the Treasury Minister has said, and I think the Chief Minister was keen to echo this, is that this tax cut is going to result in a boost to the economy.
So there's never been any evidence that works, especially when you're talking about blanket tax cuts. Doesn't happen. Targeted incentives can produce good outcomes, but the idea of giving a blanket tax break to people, I mean, take someone who's earning £100,000 a year. They've now got more money in their pocket as a result of this tax break. Is that going to change the amount of money they spend on the island? Probably not. Somebody earning £15,000 a year is going to have £0 extra pounds in their pocket as a result of this tax break. And those are the kind of people that actually would be spending money, because when you only have 15 grand a year, you spend it on rent, on your electricity, on your food, things you have to spend it on. But people at the bottom end are not helped at all by this budget. And that's the reality. And this is the thing the Treasury won't accept and won't acknowledge publicly, is that anybody who's on a low wage is actually losing out as a result. They are worse off as a result of this budget compared to what Tynwald had originally proposed back in January. This is bad for low earners. It's not good. And that's the reality of the situation. So if you're out there and you're earning £120,000 a year, you are quids in, and you'll be better off as a result of this budget. If you're out there scraping to get by, this Treasury has basically said we don't care.
3,600 people taken out of paying any tax?
Yeah, so if I'm earning £14,751, I'm £1 over the threshold. Now I won't pay any. Now I'm out of the tax threshold completely. Great. How much am I better off? 50p? 20p? That statistic is meaningless. It is totally and utterly meaningless. It's the kind of thing that government throws around when they don't want to tackle the real problems. The real issue is there are probably 4,000 people out there on the island who are not going to see any benefit at all from this budget, and there are thousands more who will be worse off because the government decided to do a massive U-turn on the way the minimum wage was being dealt with. This tax break is not a tax break for working people on low incomes. It is a tax break for higher earners, and that's the reality of it.
A previous approach that was being taken, though, in relation to getting the minimum wage increased by, the proposal was, I think it was 9%, that was causing huge consternation, particularly in the local economy. Surely to goodness you must recognise that something had to be done about that.
Absolutely, and like I've been arguing from the start, you can't push people up to a living wage without providing support for those businesses that are going to struggle. The way you do that is through your national insurance system. Businesses don't pay personal income tax. You do as an employee. It doesn't really help a business one way or the other. If you've got more money in your pocket, they're still paying you the same amount of money. Their bill is still the same. The way you help businesses is you say, well, let's reduce the national insurance rates or thresholds, because that way the employee keeps money, because employees pay national insurance, self-employed people pay national insurance, they would keep a bit more money, and of course employers paying the employer rate would keep more money. That's the solution to the problem, and as the budget documents show very clearly, the National Insurance Fund can cope with this and can accept changes to NI rates and NI thresholds. If you look at comparing us to the UK, NI is what kills us over here, because our NI thresholds are worse than the UK's. That's the problem, and it's a problem that the Treasury, I think, acknowledge, but seem completely unwilling to do anything about.
The other thing that you were particularly down on in relation to the budget was the way in which capital is now spent. The government view, at least, is that by doing quarterly assessments, you are more likely to have a price, a better price than if you wait 12 months and by the time you've waited to get the budgetary approval, the chances are the cost of producing the project has gone up.
That's the theory. In practice, though, what we've actually seen is everything taken out of the budget. So the budget no longer has funding for Castle Russian High School or whatever in it. Instead, it's, no, this will come forward as part of a quarterly programme. How many quarterly votes have come to Tynwald dealing with capital projects over the last 5 years? I think it's 2. And they were both projects that were already in the budget that were just shifted. They weren't new things. The reality is this quarterly programme the government set in place just hasn't worked. It's not delivered anything at all. And to have a member in Treasury stand up and telling everyone how great everything is and how much he's done a great job. Where's Commonmore? Where's Castle Russian? Where's Raitner Bay? Where's the housing developments in the south? Where are these proposals? Where's Tramway Terrace? Where are the capital schemes coming forward that I know for a fact have been sat on desks in Treasury or in departments for years? Where are they? And the answer is nowhere, because the Treasury capital process has completely and utterly failed to deliver.
It's a relatively new process, though. I mean, it was only introduced, this quarterly assessment, reasonably recently, surely.
Near the start of the administration, I think, they started it. And again, in principle, it's a great idea, because it means you've got 4 opportunities to come forward to Tynwald with some funding. In principle, it's excellent. In practice, it hasn't worked. And that's the issue here. You can stand up and extol the theory as much as you like, and this is what government does all the time. They say, well, this is going to work like this. Look, we've got a great scheme, a great strategy, a great plan. And you say, okay, how's that working on the ground for you? And the answer is, it's not. We've seen this time and time again, childcare strategies, autism strategies, whatever it may be. They look great on paper, but unless government actually follows through and delivers on them, they make no difference at all to people on the ground in real life. And that's what I'm worried about here, is how are people in real life being impacted by these decisions? Government seems completely oblivious.
You've been saying similar sorts of things now, well, ever since you left the Department of Health and Social Care. Are people not listening to you? Are you just not effective in getting your message over?
I think it's that the message is unpalatable, and I think you saw that with the Chief Minister replacing Alex as Treasury Minister just before January Tynwald. He doesn't like being told what's really going on. He would prefer to have people that tell him what he wants to hear, and I think that's where we're at. Is you've got a Treasury Minister now who's quite happy to toe the line and announce everything is well, but unfortunately the Emperor is wearing new clothes, and we all know where that ended up.
That was Laurie Hooper. Next, the other Ramsey MHK and recent Treasury Minister, Alex Allinson.
The new Treasury Minister has pulled lots of rabbits out of hats in advance of the forthcoming election. he only had a few days to catch those rabbits. So presumably you recognise many of them.
Yes. As Chris Thomas said, he was parachuted in at a very late stage when the Pink Book had already been written and the draft copies had been published. He and the Chief Minister decided to change a couple of key things. The big one was obviously the personal allowance and increasing that far more than I had done previously. And he's found the money for doing that and presented it, and it's been voted on and approved by Tynwald. Again, with as I said, with long-term government policy and financial policy, you need to balance things out. I tried to do that as Treasury Minister. Obviously, I had differences with the Chief Minister, particularly on minimum wage, and the new Council of Ministers have decided to do slightly different to what we'd previously agreed in December. But that is part of our democracy.
In terms then of the budget, the continued use of reserves is a concern. Chris Thomas, new Treasury Minister, seems to be taking credit for pointing members in the direction of reserves and then them criticising him for using excessive use of reserves. He's trying to have his cake and eat it there, isn't he?
No, I mean, I think in general people see use of reserves as a very bad thing, and that sooner or later we're going to go bankrupt, and I've had that levelled at me, and I think every Treasury Minister probably has. The fact that we have significant reserves is very useful. However, we also have some significant pressures on the funding of public services. And as we try to rebalance those in a very careful and thoughtful way, we will need to draw down on reserves. At the same time, what we're actually doing a lot of the time is using the interest we get on reserves rather than drawing down on the actual amount, which is why if you go onto the economic dashboard, you'll see that reserves have been increasing during the course of this administration. Have they been increasing at the same rate of inflation? Possibly not, because inflation has been outstripping economic growth. But it is a case that in the short term you can use reserves, you can make sure that we can invest in public services, but we also have to make sure that those public services are actually delivering and are value for money, and that is ongoing work that will never stop.
Fundamentally, though, we're spending more money than we've got. The income isn't sufficient to cover the actual spend. That can't go on, and yet it has been going on pretty much since 2008, when the change in the VAT sharing, revenue sharing arrangement with the UK happened. We haven't had a balanced budget since then. This has to end.
It does, and again, we're spending more money than we are taking from the economy. We have a lot in reserves. What happened sort of after 2008 was a huge amount of readjustment. Actually, without COVID, we probably would have had a balanced budget, but that's thrown everything back at least 5 years. And then since then, we've had increases in inflation with the Ukraine war and increasing energy prices. I'm not making apologies for it, but these are real challenges that government have had to make and have had to cushion the public from. By using reserves carefully, by in previous budgets putting up taxation, and by stalling the increases we wanted to make in terms of things like personal allowance and NI thresholds. We're now at the position where we can start rebalancing some of that and increasing personal allowances, making sure that people see the benefit of that long-term fiscal policy. But that work is ongoing, and actually from a Treasury perspective, we take it extremely seriously. If you look in the Pink Book at the 5-year financial plan, we do show how we can balance things out as long as we get that fiscal discipline, and that particularly comes down to health and social care and education, which by far are the biggest departments in terms of spending money, but also in terms of our benefit spending, and looking particularly at the way we operate the state pension and trying to get that on a far more sustainable basis.
What is fundamentally wrong with the budget? I mean, if you listen to your colleague in Ramsey, Laurie Hooper, it was difficult to see how we were going to survive till the end of the year. Is it as bad as that?
No. There are always challenges with budgets. We have some serious issues we need to face in terms of the size and scope of government, the money that's going into the public sector to provide the services. We need to make sure that money is well spent and done in a far more efficient way. And we need to be honest with the public in terms of what we as a nation can afford without further increases in taxation. That conversation is ongoing. This side of an election, it's a difficult conversation to have, and that's why people are perhaps a little bit afraid of it. But that conversation has to be made here as well as any other democracy, because we're seeing the costs of providing the sort of services that we have going up. What I don't want is what has been mentioned a couple of times, including by the Chief Minister, to look at perhaps changing the way we provide those services, particularly health and social care. I'm absolutely committed to the principles of the NHS. I think most of our population is. And what we need to do is make sure that Manx Care coming on budget, that the department can justify the significant investment in health and social care over this administration and make it far more transparent where that money's going and far more apparent to the public the advantages and the increased care that they will get from that investment.
That was Alex Allinson. Joni Farragher, MHK for Douglas East, is next.
You voted against the budget, but you voted for the rise in the tax allowances, personal tax allowances. Isn't that having your cake and eating it?
Hiya, Phil. Yeah, that's right. We did vote in favour of the personal allowance uplift, but against the budget in its entirety. In terms of having your cake and eating it, well, I'm not sure really. The way that the budget vote works is, first of all, we get a vote on the budget in its entirety, and then we move on to the orders, which are the things that give the Treasury the legal function to enact certain components of the budget. So you're then voting on the budget component by component. That means that you can just support the things that you think will bring the benefit to people and oppose the things that you don't, right? So the situation we were then in was that the budget had passed. Minimum wage had been, the decrease that the Chief Minister brought in the last Tynwald had been approved by Tynwald. So we had to look at all of in the context that we were in there, and we wanted to then vote for the only positive that was left on the table that would still pass the support to the most people, which was the personal allowance uplift. So yeah, we voted in favour of that.
And does that uplift in personal allowance do what's necessary in terms of people who are some of the poorest paid in the island?
No, it doesn't, and that's the exact reason that we opposed it in principle in the first place. So the actual principle of lifting personal allowance is absolutely sound. It's a good policy principle. It's something that I would tend to support because it ultimately does put more money in people's pockets. But this one being a blanket uplift rather than focusing it on the people at the lower end of the socio-economic spectrum, so those people who would have benefited from the minimum wage uplift, we need to bear in mind that the personal allowance uplift was a trade-off for not uplifting the minimum wage as much as we'd promised to do, as much as this administration had promised to do. So it should have included those lowest wage earners, but it doesn't. It doesn't do anything for those people below the tax threshold, the poorest people in our economy. However, it does uplift or give a tax cut effectively to people who are high wage earners and to all MHKs, to all politicians, to all Tynwald members. And that didn't feel right to us. Really, we would have been looking at a tapered one that gave those people who need it the most a significant uplift that would be really meaningful in their lives, that would really help them cover their financial basis and give them a little bit extra for spending in the economy. And less of a tax cut to those people on higher wages. And I don't think that that's an unreasonable position at all. I really do think that we need to be, in the government's own economic strategy, they say that they're going to use a taxation system to reduce inequality, but they haven't done anything to do that. And obviously this measure gives more to higher earners than it does to those at the lowest paid members of our society. That's deepening inequality. So it's the exact opposite of what this government has said that they're going to set out to do.
Of course, the government has said it's going to do an awful lot of things in that
Indeed.
plan, and the plan still waits to be fulfilled.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There's so many good promises in there, especially the ones that came out of the KPMG report, which did look at the impact of equality on our island and inequality and how deep the divide has become embedded really in more recent years. So I think it really just actually objectively looking at the data gives you a sort of overall picture of what's happening. And I think for me, I do like evidence-based politics. So I read the KPMG report with real interest, and the economic strategy was based, of course, upon the KPMG report. We paid, $1 million for that KPMG report, and maybe that was money well spent if we were going to actually follow it. But why spend the $1 million if we're not going to then actually enact the objective outcomes that they have identified?
And specifically then, why did the Labour Party vote against the budget?
Well, there were several reasons. Firstly, as I've just outlined, really the fact that the headline outcome of that budget, which was the uplift in personal allowance, wasn't targeted at those at the lowest end of the socio-economic spectrum. So those on the lowest pay don't get anything. They get no uplift from this budget whatsoever. And some of the higher earners below the tax cap get some of the best benefits, and that's not fair. That's not right, especially considering that it was a trade-off for not uplifting minimum wage to what this administration had promised. So that was the main reason, really. But there are some other things that we could pull out of the budget, but the main highlight was that we feel like the raid on reserves, the permanent draw on reserves that this will leave will be something that will be standing in the next administration and struggling to tackle, because we have now embedded a 24 million deficit further onto the structural deficit every year, because obviously no Treasury Minister is going to reduce personal allowance. That's not going to happen. And we can't now say in future years, well, we'll taper it. So we'll reduce it for some people and uplift it for others. That won't be politically palatable. So however we do deal with this in future, it's passing the buck onto future generations to cope with, instead of actually a sustainable, targeted and meaningful increase for people who are at the lower earners. Reserves.
There were two starkly contrasting views put forward. One was that we're spending reserves like spending reserves is going out of fashion. The other is actually reserves are holding up and we're not doing as bad as people might portray.
Yeah, and it's really interesting actually, Phil, to hear those politicians that have stood up in former years and said, we are raiding reserves, we cannot keep doing this, it's not sustainable, we don't have money to get into place housing, action on housing, we don't have money to get into place, special educational needs support in schools, we don't have money to support the suicide prevention strategy and put meaningful resources in place to tackle mental health. We don't have money for any of this for people who are vulnerable, but we do suddenly have this huge amount of cash that's a blanket uplift for people who are high wage earners, and that was really the point that I was trying to make yesterday. Was why is it always a no when we talk about people who are more vulnerable, but it's a yes when it comes to something like this? And it is interesting to see the flip from members who stood up and said we're in really challenging financial times, to suddenly hearing them say, look, actually the reserves are doing fine, we can afford this. I would like an objective review really of that. And I think some of the Treasury Minister's comments yesterday around the fact that Moody's have given us a good assessment, absolutely true, but not based on this budget. And what would they say based on this budget? And that will be an interesting upcoming thing in the future to find out.
Joni Farragher there. Next, Douglas MHK, John Wannenberg.
John, you voted against the budget. What were your reasons for doing that?
Well, first of all, Phil, I'll say that there were a number of things in the budget that I like and I agree with. But as you know, we must either vote yes or no. And the reason I voted no today, and probably one of the reasons I voted no before, was that there's a failing to address the structural deficit, and we are continuing to drift without putting the house in order for future generations. We need to secure the future for our younger people, and that budget, whilst it has some very pleasant things in it, doesn't do that.
This whole question about reserves and structural deficits. I mean, there seem to be as many answers as there were politicians as to where we actually are with this. If you listen to the ministers, inevitably the ministers are going to be more positive, aren't they? They were painting a reasonably okay sort of picture. You listen to those outsider council ministers, yourself, Laurie Hooper, various others. It was a much bleaker picture. Surely the truth must lie somewhere between those two.
Well, of course it does. But I would simply refer you back to the EPRC report, which I'm a member of, and refer you to the recommendations and the findings of that. And that will tell you very clearly as to what the situation is. And you can dress it up any way you want. I believe it was Mr. Hooper said you can put lipstick on a pig, and I don't think he's far wrong.
This is not the first time you voted against the budget. In fact, the records would attest that you've only supported one budget so far.
Well, that would be correct. If we're going to vote the budget just simply to make life easy for everybody, then you've got the wrong politician. The last 4 times I voted against it, pretty much for the same sort of reasons, but then we've got large problems. Phil, it's much like it's like a boxing bout. I'm a boxing fan. You can win a couple of rounds, but if you lose the fight, you've lost the fight.
That said, though, it is a bit of a war of attrition trying to run a government. Do you not think that government is doing its best in the circumstances to try and find the best solution for the island?
Look, I've no doubt they're doing their best. But is it good enough? No. And I'm not saying I've got all the answers. But my job as a backbencher is to probe where there are weaknesses, and that's what I'm going to do. It's like what I said about the health and social care budget of another 47 million going towards them. You cannot improve health and social care unless you have created the prosperity to do so. And that is down to all of us as politicians, but particularly down to Treasury. And that was not addressed in the budget. And these are things I need to highlight because I'm a backbencher. Now, if I was a minister, then maybe I would take a glowing reference like possibly some of those people have done. But I'm not, and I won't.
That was John Wannenberg. Finally, Treasury Minister and MHK for Douglas Central, Chris Thomas.
Was this just an election giveaway? I mean, you not only did you have Alex Allinson's rabbits to pull out of the hat, but you also had a couple of rabbits of your own. Is this affordable?
Yes, it is affordable. Pleased that Tynwald supported it. Any time is a good time to put people's money back in their own pocket so they can spend. But we also need enough funds for stable and secure public services, and to do that we need stable and secure public finances, and that's what the budget was all about. I've moved beyond the budget in some senses, so it's quite a tiring week for a Treasury Minister. You have the privilege to go and be a public representative to decide a financial plan and a budget for the following year, and then I've been talking about it in various conferences up very early this morning, and pleased to do that. So obviously there was a rebellion. You had 8 people against in Keys and 2 in Ledgeco. That's a fairly significant number of people who are opposed. It could be argued that with the election coming up, this is we're fighting for the best interests of the long-term future of the Isle of Man, and that's going to be in their manifestos. But equally, their charge to you is that actually most of the stuff that was in this budget is probably unaffordable, and this was all about getting you and the Chief Minister re-elected. And not at all. The financial plan clearly shows that we're in a clear pathway to stop the drawdown of reserves, to be able eventually to finance the capital that we need to spend from revenue again rather than from reserves, and to eliminate the structural deficit 2028, including national insurance returns. One thing I want to clear up is in 2 parts, and that's that you can use the word drawdown of reserves or burning reserves, and people think that we start with a very, very large number and we go down to a very small number because we've burned or drawn down the reserves. That's not happening. The reserves are growing. What we are doing, which can also be described as drawing down reserves, is spending the interest on those reserves. And to some extent we're taking money from the reserves when we need to. So that's what's happening. So we've got to have a clear understanding of drawn down. And the other point is we exaggerate in budgets because Treasury is a prudent place. So what by exaggerate I mean through being prudent, our outturn has been always better than what we predicted. So if I take last year, the outturn structural deficit was only £10 million, whereas it had been budgeted as £80 million deficit, 8 times better off than it had been predicted. We still had a deficit. Our expenditure was still greater than our income, but it wasn't as bad as we budgeted. And I showed clearly in the Tynwald budget speech that the budget had been to draw down £550 million, but we'd only structurally deficit used £350 million. But then there's the investment returns from the reserves to take into account as well.
That was Chris Thomas. So what do you think? Prudent budgeting or reckless use of reserves? A budget to stimulate economic activity or a blatant attempt to win your vote at the September election? I suspect the answer lies somewhere in the middle, but only time will tell. Don't forget this programme is available as a podcast. I'm Phil Gaughan. Thanks for listening.